It's a pleasure to welcome to our rostrum Walter Pavlo.
Thank you, Dean Campbell, for the introduction and obviously the invitation here today. Susie Hanna and Sarah Benson for pulling all this together. I really do appreciate it. And obviously the Haas School for your hospitality. This is my first trip to Berkeley. I've been to San Francisco a few times, but I actually went out and did a little shopping as being a tourist here from Georgia. And so I went around, I got me some T-shirts and a couple sweatshirts and a few dozen political brochures, I guess, protesting various things. So that was my experience to Berkeley has been rewarding in that way. Free the prisoners. For the next hour, I'd ask you to view me not so much as, just some lecturer, but as like a classmate. Because not too long ago, I too was in an MBA school. And I look forward to doing some great things in business, and many of my fellow classmates did a lot of good things. But I took a little bit of a different path. And it all came down to just a few decisions between what I did and what they did, in the environment that I was posed with and the environment that they were posed with. In any white-collar crime, I think that you'll find that you'll rarely see the intentions of the perpetrator to go into a known series of criminal acts. Their initial actions are usually done to mask or hide something, to protect their job. In many ways, it's really not even about the money. It's about job preservation. It's about the integrity, the perceived integrity that you have if you were to fail. The acts that are taken are done so to put off difficult decisions that are being made, or difficult things that you might want to hide. It's like, if this happens, then we'll fix that later. If that happens, we'll fix that later. But it's always later. It's always next quarter. It's always next month. And as we all see in the news today, that's exactly what's gone wrong with a lot of corporate America. A lot of the things that we've seen, mass problems that aren't just now, they're problems from years and years ago. When I was in college, believe it or not, I did take an ethics class. And one of the questions that was posed to us was, if there was a Wells Fargo truck, and it was left unguarded, and there's all these millions of dollars in there, what would you do? You're not going to get caught. Would you take it? And most of the students said, "No, I wouldn't want to do it." I even said I wouldn't do it. But in 1996, the Wells Fargo truck pulled into my garage, and I tell you, I had a much different answer then. The previous speakers to a group like this have talked about, their successes in politics or business, or their accomplishments or their status. But I can tell you that one thing about me today is different, is that I'm going to talk about failure. Not just business failure, but the failure to make proper judgments when posed with a series of different sort of decisions. The failure of carrying out actions that many of us as humans have, but we dismissed them. I didn't. Back in December, I had the privilege of speaking to a group of FBI agents out in Los Angeles. They had a conference on corporate fraud. And one of the things they're interested in is, there's no way to profile us. What goes on in corporations that makes you do what you do? So I talked to them, and the people that invited me were the very agents who had arrested me, the U.S. prosecutor who had prosecuted me. And I found that to be somewhat ironic, one, but at the same time, it was very rewarding. It was something that I could do. I could tell about my experience. And I can tell you that within the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they are very serious about white-collar crime. Not just because it's their job or something they do, but as one agent told me, he said, "I'm an investor too. I'm going to retire one day too. And I really don't want to get involved in arresting people. And I really don't want to get involved in investigating all this stuff. I want this stuff to be prevented because I'm an investor." So not only do they have a business approach to it, they have a professional responsibility. The industry in which I was involved was telecommunications. And if anyone were to look at telecommunications today, it's a complete disaster. Quest, Global Crossing, MCI, it's unbelievable. Adelphia. You can go down a whole list of what happened in that industry, and it's a total breakdown. And if you were to analyze it, one of the things that you'd see is the problem is the relationship between the carriers themselves. They almost all brought it on themselves. And a lot of what I'll describe today will tell you a little bit about those relationships. I think we've seen some of them called swap agreements and questionable recognition of revenue, masking of accounting fraud or masking of accounting records in order to it created some fraud. But what was very unique about the 1990s was that suddenly all these unlikely competitors found each other competing in a marketplace called the stock market. So they're unlikely because now General Motors is now competing against Pepsi, and MCI is competing against Starbucks. They're all trying to get investor dollars. Something.com competing against everybody. And it was an unprecedented bull market. So in that way, these companies had to get out there and they had to aggressively market their company for investors. A lot goes on in corporate America that is good. In fact, most of what goes on in corporate America is good. But today, many of the leaders in corporations are very young. They're aggressive. They have innovative ideas, some innovative to the point of questionable legality, as we saw, I think, with some of the Enron transactions. But the pressures and the expectations that you have as a young executive in the company are great. You want to be part of the inner circle. You want to be promoted. You want to be liked. And you want that recognition that comes with the job. And one of the things that I found out is these analyst expectations, you know, we're going to make 10 cents this quarter or 12 cents, don't fall on the CEO and the CFO alone. They fall on management. Management that you'll go into. You'll start in middle management. That's where you guys will start out when you come right out of school. And you'll find yourself in a very unique position that you can have a direct impact on the outcome of those earnings. And you can either do it in a right way or you can do it in a wrong way. So the example that the executive set is of utmost importance within an environment. Before going any further, and before I really get into a lot of the aspects of what I did and the things that I saw, I want everyone to know that I blame no one for my actions other than myself. I was presented with a unique situation, and I decided to act in the way that I did. The actions that led me to prison, I deeply regret, and I've hurt a number of people. And I do not see myself as a victim of this environment that I will talk about today. Justice did not allow it, nor will I. But what I did at MCI was see a very corrupt environment. Rather than trying to change it, report it, or just walk away, I decided to join in on the spoils. Initially, I saw no victim in my crime. And as I will explain later, nor did my superiors see a victim in their own actions. I'm speaking to you today, besides the FBI, was something that my dad had asked me. Shortly before I went to prison, he and I had a chance to kind of talk, and it was just a few days away from going away, and sort of the cold reality of what has gone on hit us both. And during that walk, my dad asked me what I felt was a profound questions that dads are always very good at asking. But we went for this long walk, grabbed me, kind of looks me in the eyes and goes, "Son, what in the hell were you thinking?" And I said, "Well, you know what, Dad? That's a great question. That's a very good question." And I said, "I don't know the answer to that." And you know what? The FBI never really asked me that question, or the federal prosecutor. They asked me what I did. They asked me how I did it. But they didn't ask me what I was thinking. What was my thought process that went into committing a crime or heading down this path? When I first entered prison, I did very little thinking about business, about what the heck I had been doing. I kind of distanced myself. It's a bit of a shock at first when you first go in. It's unimaginable. A friend of mine once asked me, he said, "What was it like going to prison?" I said, "Well, what do you think it was like?" And he said, "I couldn't imagine." And I said, "That's exactly what it was like." It's a surreal experience. But I tell you what, I did do a lot of thinking about what my dad had asked me, what I had been thinking. What was it that went into the thoughts and that led me to the actions that I ended up doing. And I started to think, and I started to write. I used to keep a little diary beside my bed at night, and I'd kind of wake up and I'd jot down these lines, and I was trying to piece together exactly what it was that I had been thinking. And about the same time that I had this revelation, I said, I know exactly what I've been thinking. It took me almost a year to kind of piece everything together. And I had just like anybody in MBA school, I'd written all this junk out all over pieces of paper and pieced it all together. But right about that time, I'd gotten a subscription to Forbes magazine, of all magazines. And within that magazine was an article entitled Bandwidth, Dreams, and Greed, something like along those lines, the fall of telecommunications. So I hadn't read any business periodicals for about a year because I wanted nothing to do with business for a little bit. I was more interested in playing softball and lifting weights. But I read the article with a lot of interest because it was a guy's theory about what happened in telecommunications. His bandwidth, dreams, and greed kept coming back to me. And I said, I want to say something. So I wrote this guy. The guy's name was Neil Weinberg, senior editor at Forbes. And I told him that his title was only half right, and it was based on greed alone. And I said, here's what happened to me. Within 5 days of me sending out this letter to Forbes magazine, Neil Weinberg was on a phone call in an administrator's office within the prison. They told me they had a phone call. So I go up and ask, who is it? And he says, Forbes magazine. And I was shocked that somebody actually would listen to what I had to say. And Neil got on the phone. He says, well, Pavlo, this is Neil Weinberg. I read your letter. I'm very interested in talking to you and doing an interview. How do I get in? I said, get in? Hell, I don't know how to get out. You have to figure that out. I've got no clue. But within 3 days, he did figure it out. And so within a week of me writing a letter, getting a phone call, he was sitting in a conference room in Edgefield Federal Prison. And we talked for a day. And he tape recorded me, and he listened to the story, and he wrote the story. And today, what I'm going to talk to you guys about is pretty much that same story. It's what the hell I was thinking. Maybe that's a better title for what I should put up here. That interview was some 6 months before the revelations that we all now know as the downfall of WorldCom. The multi-billion-dollar fraud that brought down the company. WorldCom bought MCI. Now, I had nothing to do with the $6 billion fraud that you read about. But I do know about the culture, and I did know about the business decisions that were going on within MCI, within like WorldCom, and within the telecommunications industry as a whole. And when I found out that that fraud was in the billions of dollars, I was not surprised by the fraud. I was surprised like anybody else about the amount of the fraud. But the fraud itself did not surprise me or shock me, and that in itself is disturbing. I think I've got some slides. I want to try. I usually don't do this with slides, but I want to talk to you I started working at MCI in Atlanta in the summer of 1992 as a manager of collections and billing. These companies that bought and sold long distance. You can kind of see, you got MCI over here. They allow access to MCI's network. These resellers take it and repackage it and put their own name brand on it, and then they make payments back to MCI. Just think of it like a widget. They buy widgets in mass, and they slap their own label on it without going into all the technical aspects of what goes into long distance. MCI has a giant network, and they resold on that network. I was responsible for collections and posting payments and credits to a number of accounts and some fast-growing accounts, one of which was a company called Long Distance Discounters. The president of that company and the founder's name was Bernie Ebbers. At the time, Bernie Ebbers was just wearing a cowboy hat and kind of hanging out down there in Jackson, Mississippi. And I got to meet him on several occasions, but I never thought of him as anything but just a very down-to-earth person. He's the way that he's portrayed now is much different. He was seen as kind of just a regular guy. He was the guy you rooted for. The total revenue at the time for MCI's carrier market when I was there was about $250 million a month. it's a good size amount of money, but it's not really big as to what it grew into. Within 3 years after I had taken that position, I was responsible for collections and billing for their revenue that had grown to $1 billion a month. And I had a staff of 120, and I've been promoted 3 times to become senior manager of the department. I was 32 years old at the time. MCI had always been known as an aggressive company. It's one of the reasons that I went to work there, right out of MBA school. It was the first position that I took. Its seed capital came from Drexel Burnham. Michael Milken was a personal friend of our founder, Bill McGowan. The seed money all came, approximately $1 billion to start MCI. It was an aggressive company. It happened during some boom times. Another interesting fact that I found out about MCI was that in the 1980s, AT&T had launched an innovative product called 1-800-OPERATOR. Now, the purpose of that was to capitalize on these payphones and calls from hotels. We dial 1-800-OPERATOR. Just there's different products that are out there today that are very similar. But it was a very unique product and one that MCI hadn't thought of yet. So they wanted to capitalize, too, on having their own operator services platform, so that instead of dialing 0 at a payphone, you dialed 1-800-OPERATOR, and the revenue flowed that way. Well, MCI was crafty. Because one of the things I loved about the company is how crafty they were, is that they had gained control over misspellings of the word operator, which I thought was very innovative. So MCI had these misspellings, and operator, who knows how to spell? I don't even know if we go around the room and everybody's going to get it right every time, but the AR, ER, 0R at the end of the number all became owned by MCI. And overnight, MCI was the number 2 operator services long-distance company without spending a penny. I want to go work for those guys. It was a unique company. There were huge salaries being paid within the company, a lot of sales organizations, within the sales organizations. There were pep rallies. And when I'd go into these pep rallies, an executive would be up there talking, and he'd say, there's certain seats that have money under them, and they'd all go scrambling. And it was a money frenzy that they seemed to be feeding. The mentality within the company was just get it done. Just do it. Ask for forgiveness rather than permission. We were all young. We were all aggressive. Few people knew about telecommunications. It's just been deregulated. We had all come from various different backgrounds. What did you learn over here in the computer business? All right, well, do something like that over here. I was in the defense industry before that. He said, well, do something what you did in defense and bring it here. We need to figure out what we're doing. And the final thing that really attracted me was stock options. Stock options and stock options. That was what MCI was all about, growing the stock. And in an environment like that, and that kind of sales growth, you were literally flying by the seat of your pants. And I tell you what, I loved every minute of it. It was a new challenge every day. There was a lot of people telling you what a great job you did. All your ideas are seen as innovative because we didn't know what the hell we were doing. It made it that much easier to guide things. And even at a young age, they give you that kind of responsibility. MCI's carrier group was broken into 3 distinct areas. Tier 1, which some of you may not understand, Tier 1 is like AT&T and Sprint. They bought a considerable amount of long distance from MCI, just like MCI bought it from them. That was part of the deal. All that relationship, they're very relationship sort of driven, but they're very safe customers. High volume, very low risk, and a low profit for what I just mentioned. It's a relationship. We got to go buy long distance from them, so you're going to give them a pretty good deal. Tier 2, again, is low risk. These are mostly like NASDAQ type companies. They're very well financed. They're high volume, which is why they get their profits down. A little bit more profit than what than what I had above. And then finally, you have Tier 3. This is when like the thunder and lightning should come in here. These are small carriers. These are guys, the barrier to entry to get into telecommunications was unbelievably low. There's no real big licensing and everything to go through. You ride on MCI's network. You resell it. So the barrier to entry was very low. The breakdown of these three types of revenue was that Tier 1 and Tier 2 obviously made up a huge portion of the revenue for the corporation. It was about 80%, and Tier 3 was about 20%. But here's an interesting thing. The profit was all coming from Tier 3. And as we all know on Wall Street, revenue only goes so far. The most important thing is earnings. So here you have the seeds to what I call the tragedy, is that the profit for a certain segment now is in your highest risk group. These companies are not very well funded. They're mostly renting their space. In fact, let me go to the next slide. I think I might be able to help us out here. Just go into that. Their equipment is leased. Their building is leased. They just really have this long distance that they're buying. Well, MCI had an idea. We're going to drive the profits up, and we're going to let all these guys on the network, as many as we can. And these companies build anywhere from $50,000 a month up to a couple $1 million a month. Very small in relation to the other carriers. There were no deposits being required. We were doing very little in the way of background checks because we needed to fill up. We did have a network that was underutilized as well. So not only were we going to let them on, there was plenty of room for them, and that was where the big profits were. And by profits, I'm talking 75 to 100%. These are big numbers. There were a lot of new products that were also being introduced, particularly this low end. Debit cards, the ones that we see when you go to a convenience store now, a lot of those were coming out at the time. And those were mostly marketed by the smaller carriers that were out there. And another thing that was booming was the 900 business. Pornography, gambling, Miss Cleo. That's business. Those are very high profit centers that you don't look at it and say, oh, they're in the pornography industry. You don't ask. You say you're a 900 number, and here are the revenues, and here's the profit margins that we're going to have. The next thing that happens is that third-tier carriers, being highly leveraged, or I don't even know, there's no leverage there, they all of a sudden decided that they're not going to pay MCI anymore for their services. They have one pretty big bill a month, and that's MCI. Third-tier carriers, they bill about, let me give you an example, they bill about like $1 million a month to their, from MCI. There used to be about $1 million a month. Let's say they mark that up 40%. We'll do easy math. $1.4 million in retail sales. So they send out all their invoices, and all this money comes in. $1.4 million comes in to this guy who was leasing cars last year. And he says, man, this is a lot of money. And at the end of the day, when he's running it legitimately, let's just say he has a 10% return on the $1.4 million. That's $140,000 a month in profit. And that's achievable within long distance. But the thing that I found out, and the thing that they found out quickly, is it wasn't 1.4 million. And so they started dipping into this, this revenue stream. They started not paying MCI. They started diverting funds that we found out to business organizations that they had started. They paid themselves extravagant salaries for these small companies. And there was really not a lot that I perceived that I could do in trying to round up this money. And I was just watching it go away from the company. And the bills started to mount. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of some of the things that I ran into on a couple of these companies, just so you kind of get the flavor of what I was up against when I go out. Because my job in billing and collections also was to go out and get the money in. In fact, that's where I spent the majority of my time, was going out to these high-risk carriers and saying, hey, look, you got to pay your $5 million that you owe. And they'd say, okay, yeah, the check's in the mail. Well, let me give you a couple examples of the checks in the mail. One of these companies was called Caribbean Telephone and Telegraph, based out of Detroit, Michigan. In 1995, this small company that printed debit cards went from billing $50,000 a month, this is within 1 year, went from billing $50,000 a month to $10 million a month in long distance with MCI. And eventually, before we ended up disconnecting them, Caribbean Telephone and Telegraph had run up over $100 million in usage on MCI's network that was unpaid. One person had asked me previously, how do you let a customer run up a $100 million bill? And I said, because nobody wanted to write off 99. There was a lot of revenue that was on the table, and there was a lot of profit that was on the table. Their primary product was, as I said, was these debit cards in ethnic areas. They would go into like Little China and sell these debit cards with a special rate to China. They would go into a Vietnamese area, and they would sell a debit card with a great rate to Vietnam, to Mexico, to the Caribbean. And we found out that they were selling it much lower than the cost that was under their contract. I'd get these flyers, and they would tell me that, all of a sudden they're calling to India, it's 40 cents a minute. Well, the rate in your contract is 80. You're not going to make this up on volume. And the thing that got me too is like, what Caribbean Telephone and Telegraph had discovered was that they had a money printing machine. These debit cards now are money. If there's no intention to pay for the underlying thing, you churn them out. You churn them out. But there was another problem that I was wondering. I was like, how in the heck are you guys getting all these out on the street? You're only talking about a company of, at the height, 20 people. It's very small. So how are you guys getting these out there? Oh, it's easy. Well, let me show you. I mean, and what they did was they went to cigarette salesmen, soda pop, beer guys that had all these truck routes, and they sold them a big stack of cards for cash. And these guys that were going to these convenience stores anyway slammed them all out. Voila, an instant sales force. $10 million a month sales force. I visited these guys in their New York office. Some trashy little office they had off to the side. And when I went in there, I saw duffel bags full of money on the floor, probably $5 or $6 million in cash. And I'm supposed to go up there to collect, and I said, this isn't going to fit in the overhead bin, for one thing. The other thing is we would all know you're not going to collect that money. That money's, there's no way. You had sort of these armed sort of neighborhood thugs watching out for him while we waited for some truck to come around and haul this off to God knows where. And I went back and I told my bosses, this was when they only owed us about $40 million. I said, we got a problem. They're not going to pay anything. I said, I didn't go to a telecom company. I went to a crack house. And I said, there's so much money around here. You guys wouldn't believe what's going on. But we still clung to the fact at MCI that we could get that money. We still wanted to believe that revenue, and you can imagine you imagine what kind of car the MCI salesman was driving that went from $50,000 a month to a $10 million a month. Everybody was clinging to that deal as tight as they could. Another example was a Canadian company. And they owed us about $2 million. So I went up there to visit them. I said, you guys owe us $2 million. What are we going to do? Well, Walt, we're traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. This is after we're at the very end. There's obviously nothing left. We're on the Toronto Stock Exchange, and we're trading at 50 cents a share. And I said, well, everybody knows when you get down to that level, there's really no value. It's just some perceived value. So we worked a deal, and I said, all right, we'll take 4 million shares if that's what you're offering. Yeah, that's what we're offering. Let's do 4 million shares. So they gave us 4 million shares, and we even agreed to, at MCI, a lockup agreement for a year because we knew we couldn't sell it anyway. So the debt was quasi-canceled. We got our 4 million shares. And I came back to work, and everybody, oh, man, well, this will work out. We got something on the books. It's better than nothing. Well, when I got in the office the next day, I had the Wall Street Journal call me and said, we would like you to comment on MCI's investment of $4 million into this company because the stock's going through the roof. And I was, oh, my God, this isn't, we were just swapping debt, So, here are these guys, they got me, It was a great con. And they're selling their shares, and I'm sort of left holding the bag. We eventually did get some return out of that ordeal, but it's sort of the mentality I think you can grasp, if you can grasp that. We'd go to collect money and find empty offices. They had never been there. We'd go to other places and it had been ransacked and all their computer equipment was gone and moved to another location. We had carriers returning, instead of being Walt Telecommunications, and we disconnected them because they weren't paying, they come back as WTC. You know, we didn't catch that. They put them right back on the network, same location. It was such a frenzy, and we were so behind the times that we were missing out on this. And a lot of these were driven by very aggressive sales and marketing programs. And I can tell you, within finance, we viewed sales as the enemy because of all this stuff that they were throwing at us. The solutions to the problem that we had at MCI, and ones which we did use for a while, was let's develop a payment plan. You can repay your debt over a period of time to MCI. We'll even maybe do a promissory note and spread it out over like 2 or 3 years, and you guys can pay us back because you owe us a couple $1 million and you're obviously not going to pay us. We asked for deposits. We asked for payments in full if we could, or at the end, we just simply disconnect service and try to sue them. At no time when I was at MCI, even when we had evidence of these carriers pricing below levels within their contract, or distributing funds that we know that should have gone to MCI. Never once did we ever go to the FBI or the FCC to report it. And I thought that was very significant when I was there. The next problem is that MCI enthusiastically recorded all this revenue from this high-risk group. We were meeting analyst expectations, and certainly those of our superiors, and seemingly those of our shareholders. Monthly meetings with young, aggressive MBAs such as myself would meet, and I'd tell them the bad news, because we know in business, always get shot. And you keep delivering this bad news, it's going to get bad, guys. These guys aren't paying. What are we going to do? You can't write it off, Walt. It's not in the plan. And now we're talking about significant dollars, a significant dollar amount. At the time, I had a salary of approximately $75,000 a year, responsible for 120 people, and $1 billion a month in collections and billing. And I went to my boss and I said, you know what, I don't think that's really a lot of money. He said, it's not. He says, but you're getting extra stock options this year, Walt. All right, that's even better. I'll take that. But I tell you what that message sent to me is that it is important that you meet the numbers. It's not as important that you do your job. We began hiding bad debt at MCI. One of the ways that we did that was with Caribbean Telephone and Telegraph. We had them execute a promissory note to MCI in the amount of $100 million. And I was informed to tell our auditors, who was Arthur Anderson, that there was a high probability that we would collect those funds. And I did that. I told them that the money was going to come in. This was after I'd even visited some $50 million before and told them that it wasn't going to come in. Weaker companies that were indebted to MCI were being purchased by other companies, and we would conceal the debt that they owed MCI, sometimes as a favor, sometimes as a way to help us meet our numbers. Then we began applying current payments on past due balances that customers may have been disputing on their bills at MCI. We accelerated contractual credits on unsigned contracts to hide past due balances. In other cases, we delayed credits from signed contracts in order to meet our financial results. We began applying payments with approved accounting codes based on the promise that the check was in the mail so that we could meet our numbers at month end. This is a perception that you're not really doing accounting anymore. You're just trying to give a perception of what's going on. So if a guy says he's sending you a $5 million check, you go, okay, that's great. Your order's in. Get that posted immediately. And we did post it. The companies that were disconnected for non-payment were held on MCI's books as collectible revenue. And then I'm by myself. My mentor had hired me, left the department in 1995 because of the pressures that I've described. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy and served 2 tours in Vietnam. He's a man of the highest integrity, and he was my mentor, and we worked closely together. And for the pressure to build on somebody of that character, it tells you a little bit about the environment that I was in. I wrote a memo to my superiors in late 1995 that the bad debt for the upcoming year in 1996 would be in excess of $80 million, excluding our $100 million on the Caribbean telephone and telegraph note. Further, I told them that there was probably a likelihood of another $70 million that most likely is going to happen in the next 12 months. $250 million in bad debt. It should be noted that MCI's write-offs for the 3 previous years in my carrier segment have been about $12 million a year. $250 million in 1 year is catastrophic. The response to my memo was quick and swift. Your budget for 1996 is $15 million in bad debt write-off. Under those circumstances, I was promoted to senior manager of the Carrier Finance Division. I had designed most of the accounts receivable systems and audit functions. So I was an expert at detecting anomalies or hiding them. I was alone and distant from my new boss. And then I made probably the biggest mistake of my life. I confided in somebody outside of MCI of what was going on, the problems that I was under, the pressures that I was under. And he listened to me. And he had a solution. He had a plan. My actions from here remind me of what baseball player Ken Caminetti said regarding his steroid use. I don't hold Mr. Caminetti as some sage of wisdom, but what he did say was, at first I felt like a cheater, but I looked around and everybody else was doing it. It's an age-old saying. Everybody else was doing it. You know what? I had an idea too. I'll put them all up there as he hit you with it all at the same time. The crime had already been set up. It was already set to happen. There was nothing unique. Some of what I'm going to talk about you couldn't do on a regular business, on how you would approach these customers and tell these customers the things that I was going to tell them. The environment was already there for it to be successful. There was very little that I was going to have to do. I approached customers in this Tier 3 group that owed MCI money. I knew that they were desperate. I knew that they were on the shady side anyway. They were taking money due to MCI, and I had a lot of evidence to that effect. MCI, on the other hand, was not going to acknowledge any of this bad debt. They were just going to continue to let this sort of progress, and that's the direction that we were heading in. That's made evidence by the budget that they had just handed me. The goals of the company were going to be met, and I had a plan to meet the goals of the company as well. So I approached customers that owed MCI money and told them that they're either going to pay up or I'm going to disconnect you and sue you. It's a recognizable, sensible sort of approach. I could be tough on these guys. You don't pay for your service, you're going to be disconnected. One such customer, which was the first customer that I had dealt with under the scheme that I'm going to talk about, was a guy who was starting an internet company, and of all places over across the bay here, where he'd offered me 10% of the company, $100,000 signing bonus, $200,000 a year. Here I am making $75,000, and I said no. That in itself should have been some siren that went off even in my own head about what I was about ready to do. But I knew all the money that he had. He was starting his internet company was stolen. It was diverted from bills that he should be paying to MCI. So I turned him down. And I said, but you better pay your long distance bill. My partner then outside the company would go into the same customer and say, you know what, I've got some investors in Europe, and they're very interested in investing in telecommunications companies here in the United States. Telecommunications is booming. It's legitimate. It's a legitimate business sort of way for him to get in there. And in this due diligence of looking whether he wants to invest or not, he finds out, oh, what you guys see here, you owe MCI, $2 million. Yeah, we got to take care of that. Well, I'll tell you what. This is my partner talking now. I'm going to pay that debt. I'm going to pay that $2 million because I want you to be more responsible. I want you to be a better customer, and then we can grow. We'll get you more money down the line, but I'm going to pay you $2 million. And he says that for putting this together, I'm going to get $250,000 sort of kind of a fee for arranging this financing. I'm going to get 25% ownership in your company. And then you're going to pay me back on a promissory note over the next 3 years in the amount of $10,000 a week. All funds were going to be paid to the European investors through banks, very recognizable banks in the Cayman Islands. Again, very legit for offshore sort of relationships. Under our scheme, under our plan, under our crime, no money would ever be handled in the United States. The customers paid willingly, and they entered into formal contracts to the effect, giving them the perception that their debt was going to be paid at MCI. I, on the other hand, was still at MCI. And I cooked the books for myself. And I hid all the debt to give the perception that, in fact, we had gotten $2 million in. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. It was too easy. No sound financial institution would have loaned these carriers any money. No bank, no investor. But here comes our little angel. One of the things that I also took advantage of is of the 120 individuals that worked for me at MCI, 50 of them were temporary contractors. In an effort to reduce overhead, the company had decided to use a number of temporary help. The turnover within the department exceeded 100%. So it was very easy for me to kind of move things around with very little questions that are being asked. We did this with 7 customers at MCI and had over $5 million in the Cayman Islands within 6 months. We at least on paper owned 25% of these companies that had revenue of $100 million a year, and we began to lay plans to take this hodgepodge public. MCI had not realized any bad debt. The carrier got to still use the MCI network. MCI stock continued to rise. So the shareholders were taken care of, weren't they? And to assure that MCI would not come after me, perhaps I had read too many John Grisham novels prior to this, I began to accumulate documents on their own misdeeds and the ones that I was involved in at the company. What I'd do is, if they ever did find out anything that I was doing, I'd have a peek at their hand, they could have a peek at my hand, and I would be a ship that would never come into port and walk away. I thought that the revenge on MCI was enough to make me happy. For a short while, certainly the money in the Cayman Islands that I had did make me feel good. But then the reality of what I had done, what I was involved in, hit me. Became excessive drinker, used prescription drugs just so I could sleep. If I discovered anything about myself during this whole thing, was that I had a conscience. That conscience sought to destroy me. I hid from my family and friends and business associates the truth of my ill dealings. In February of 1997, I received a call from a director at MCI while I was in Palm Springs, California on business. They had detected an anomaly in accounting that they didn't have an answer for. And I was being called back from Palm Springs back to Atlanta, Georgia, not as a suspect, but to investigate. I had been caught, but nobody knew I'd been caught. But I was at the point of a nervous breakdown at the time from all this experience and my hiding. And I told him that, and he'd say, hey, why don't you come back and fix the books? And I go, hey, look, nobody else is involved and I don't want to talk about it. He said, well, just come back and let's talk. Let's sit down and, let's find out what's going on. And I left MCI, and I never returned. MCI began to get information from customers about the dealings with my partner and discovered then a number of other anomalies. And soon they put two and two together on what had become a $35 million fraud against the company. It should be noted that the initial inquiry to the FBI about the fraud did not come from MCI. It came from these customers who were involved. In fact, according to the Forbes investigation, MCI never disclosed the fraud, even in the middle of the negotiations with their then suitor, British Telecommunications. The carrier department that I headed soon after, within weeks after discovering what I had done, was disassembled. It was moved from Atlanta, Georgia to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. 120 employees were displaced. My director was removed from MCI, put on a consulting contract that contained terms to allow him to have his lucrative stock options and salary, so long as he did two things: cooperate against me and say nothing derogatory about MCI. Those are the exact terms in his contract. Upon the expiration of his contract with MCI, he was hired by Arthur Anderson, who in turn bought this place. For a period of time, I would calculate the losses that I had given up in my stock options. Because having left and pre-merger, I didn't get the chance to really enjoy the fruits of all the stock options that they had given me. But had I stayed with the merger and the ensuing stock run-up that it was eventually WorldCom, I would have had stock value in excess of $1 million. So the one thing that they did speak the truth about when I was in the company is that stock options had a lot of value. Thus began a run from my past. I hired one of the best lawyers in Atlanta, a guy named Bruce Morris. And we set out to defend me against actions I knew I was guilty of. From February of 1997 until August of 2000, I lived with the thought of being arrested and facing a term in prison. Meanwhile, my lawyer kind of danced with the FBI, MCI, and some banks who kind of became embroiled in this whole big fiasco. It was a very painful time for me and my family. Just over almost 4 years of looking over your shoulder. Finally, in August of 2000, still exhausted, I went to my attorney and said, one, I'm out of money, which he didn't want to hear. And two, I can't do this anymore. I got to put this behind me some way. So I said, go to the prosecutor and let's get the best deal that we can. And for once, I could do the right thing. I cooperated with the FBI and the IRS on everything that I and others had done, even informed them of MCI's own misdeeds. But I tell you what, I must have sounded sort of desperate, like a desperate guy just grasping at anything to get out of trouble. I wasn't very coherent anyway. I wasn't telling the story like I'm able to tell it to you today. And then again, I thought maybe that's just how business is done. Maybe that's the way things are done, and maybe I did it wrong. Maybe what I did was just so wrong, but I shouldn't have deviated from that path, what they were doing. Pled guilty to wire fraud, money laundering, and received an enhancement for obstruction of justice for my role in a shredding incident, which is quite popular today. In October of 2000, the same time that I had entered my guilty plea in federal court, WorldCom, by then the owner of MCI, announced a $600 million charge against revenue for bad debt associated with MCI's old carrier division that I had once headed. It seemed a convenient time to dump the old trash. Stock was taking a beating anyway, so they announced this one-time charge. That transaction soon became a target for a shareholder lawsuit and an SEC investigation. In March of 2001, I entered federal prison in Jessup, Georgia, to begin serving my sentence, which is 41 months. I was then transferred to Edgefield, South Carolina, and during that transit, I was taken down to Tallahassee, Florida, spent time in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary for 2 weeks. My roommate, in Atlanta Penitentiary had been 17 years in Leavenworth, Kansas. I'd let him know what was going on in the world, and he let me kind of know where he had been. I was not very interested in his story. We were locked in a cell together for 24 hours a day, receiving 2 cold showers a week. Even the camps where I did do my federal time were safe, but they were scary at the same time. I can tell you there's no such thing as club fed. During my stay, I did find a few good friends in whom I could confide. One very special friend was a man named Mark Whitaker. Mark was an FBI informant for 3 years in the Archer Daniel Midland antitrust case. He's doing a 9-year sentence for taking $11 million while he was cooperating with the FBI. He's a very interesting guy. But we talked a lot, and he's a couple years older than me. And the parallels that we drew from our experiences were eerie. The pressures, the environment, the revenge, the money, the youth lost from a lack of guidance. Mark and I followed the corporate scandals that began to unfold themselves, particularly in the fall of 2001 with Enron. The names of the characters and the allegations, the ones you know and the ones we talked about while we were in prison. Ken Lay, Andrew Fastow, Bernie Ebbers, Scott Sullivan, Sam Waxel, Martha Stewart, Dennis Kozlowski. And when you look at Kenneth Lay of Enron, or Bernie Ebbers of WorldCom, and you hear their version of the story these days, which is most likely through a spokesman, is I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know that they were doing that. Does that sound like a credible defense for a CEO? Either way, they're going to lose, and a jury may one day decide whether or not they really knew what was going on. It is a reflection of the company when fraud occurs. It is a reflection of the CEO and the CFO, the leaders within that organization. These same guys used to tell us that crap flowed downhill. It goes the other way. My actions, the lowest levels of the corporation, are a reflection on those individuals as well. Ethics is important. I think a classic example of just ethics in general of a direct impact on a company is what's happening to Martha Stewart and Omni Media. Omni Media has not been accused of doing anything. They don't have any accounting problems. Martha Stewart entered into a small transaction that's got all these questions associated with it. Now, Omni Media's stocks lost billions of dollars based on an ethics, based on a perceived, a bad judgment. To have losses like you see at Omni Media, it'd almost be like a company that announced like you had a new respirator made out of asbestos. You know, we got this new great product, and your stock's going to go quickly downhill. In the end, the shareholders are the ones that are suffering. The meltdown of WorldCom was so severe that it spread not only to shareholders but to employees, vendors, the community, and eventually the stock market itself. Alas, the victims emerged. The size and impact of WorldCom bankruptcy is staggering. WorldCom's bankruptcy filing largely wipes out the market capitalization that at its peak was $180 million. It's like erasing the assets of 1.5 million Americans. In terms of revenue, WorldCom's filing would be roughly equivalent to United Airlines, Delta, and Southwest going out of business all on the same day. WorldCom's 2001 revenue of $35 billion is roughly the same size as the gross domestic product of Ecuador. Business will always rely more on self-policing rather than disclosure of wrongdoing. The costs of disclosure are much too high. I don't think anybody wants to get up and announce that their company, hey, you know, we found a couple guys, they ripped us off for about 3 or 4 million, but we got them. What does that say about the company? You can't make those. It's got to be prevention. It's got to be yourselves thinking about the impacts of your actions. You are tomorrow's, and probably in very many ways today's, business leaders. And it will be up to you to set the standard of an ethical behavior for those that work for you, and you should demand it from those that you work for. The job of the FBI or the SEC is to clean up the accident after it's happened. And by that time, the damage has been done. And the best way to describe it is a catastrophic failure. In closing, I'd like to share with you a statement that I read when I was being sentenced from a U.S. federal judge, Tidwell, in Atlanta, Georgia. I guess it was a time when I'd say, well, let me tell a little bit about my story. I didn't have any idea I'd be doing this kind of stuff. But it was a chance for me to kind of say something about who I was and what went on. My closing statement was something as follows. It has been said that the road to a righteous life is a narrow one, but it is a road nonetheless, and not a tightrope. I should have known better, and I vow to do better. Today, you in the Haas School have given me that opportunity to fulfill that vow, a way for me to give back just a little bit of what I took. It is my sincere wish that you can learn from my story, that we can all begin to restore confidence in our businesses, in our financial markets. It is our duty to learn from this tragic time in business and to make it better. In a book that I had read one time called Believing in Myself, there was a quote in there which I really enjoy and I cling to, especially these days. Is to fail to learn from our past mistakes, is to have a hand in our own injury. This work that you will go out and do in business is going to be difficult, and the recovery to rebuild the integrity that we have in business is going to be a lengthy one. But it can be done. I wish you all success in your careers and in meeting the many challenges that you'll face not only in business, but in life. Thank you for your time and attention. Yeah. You guys have any questions? I'm sure you guys have seen, Oz on television. I can tell you whether or not any of that stuff's true. Yes? No, I'm not. In fact, I had no intentions of really kind of getting into this. I was at work under a kind of a work release halfway house situation, and back in I think it was like November, and I was telling the dean about this. I was working in a shipyard in Savannah, Georgia, at the time, and my human resources officer said, "Hey, there's 2 FBI agents who want to talk to you." And oh, jeez, I said, "There's no way." I told them everything. What did I leave out? And they had asked me to come to their national conference on corporate fraud and speak. I guess by then they had seen the Forbes article, and I'd since talked to them a number of times. So they thought it would be a good idea, mostly talk about the environment. I've been very careful not to think that this is, that I perceive myself as some victim in all this thing. I had my own choices, but it's good for me. I enjoy doing it. Yes.
The journalism will have a position for you last year. So you've been spending an awful lot of time in actually talking about business press coverage of all these scandals. And I wonder what your perception is of the media's role in improving coverage of ethical questions, of ethical conduct, of county scandals, having had a chance to look back and see.
Yeah, in many ways, it's been a media frenzy. You only hear the bad news anymore. I think it's very difficult to get any good news out there. It seems that like every CEO that's been on the cover as CEO of the year is now in trouble himself in some way or the other. I think the thing we all have to realize is that we're human, and there, in business there's a lot of transactions that happen, and some of which we have control over, and some of which we don't. But I believe that we've gotten to a point of a bit of overkill as far as blasting business. I think at some point we're going to have to turn the corner, because even as a as a convicted felon, I'm tired of it. I mean, for a while I said, well, thank God I'm not the only one. So I enjoyed reading about all the other hardship that somebody else was. Them. Go look at them. But I think now it's certainly. I'd like to see more positive press. I think it's too negative, and I don't think we've seen anything yet. I think 2004, when the trials start, is going to be a craze. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I guess I have two parts. I first want to thank you for giving a really well-crafted talk.
Thank you.
I just thought it was amazing the way you started with the idealism as a young MBA, with which we had many around here. And then you kind of anchored it on your dad asked you what
It's a good story.
the business of the journalist who asked you to reflect on it all, and then you proceeded to reflect. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
My question has to do with a comment Sarah Watkins,
Mm-hmm.
and on whistleblower, and she said to us that very early on she had indications that Enron was not really what she looked up at him to be. And her example was that he made the whole corporation use his sister's crowd.
Right.
And that should have given her something.
Right.
Did you have any really early indications that MCI might have not been what it was chalked up to be?
There was such a frenzy within telecommunications, and I'm not sure. I don't know the natural gas or energy business, but it was a deregulated industry, and I think there's a lot to be learned about what's going on in deregulation with the trouble the airlines are having, Enrons and MCI that definitely needs to be looked at. But no, I didn't. I mean, I saw there were so many people making so much money, inside and outside of the company, that it just gave this perception that it's all good. How can anything be wrong? I mean, it's not just an isolated incident. It was just across the board, which really brings up another point of, how do you keep this from your wife? Or I should say my wife at the time. And it's just the same way you kept it from your friends. Look what he's doing. Look at that industry he's in. Everybody's rich. There's money just everywhere. So, within that was, yet another camouflage of what went on within the industry, and with all the success. Even when I first started hiding bad debt for the company, I looked and said, well, we grew so much last year. Certainly, we're next year we can make up for this anomaly that's going on now. And that wasn't true. That was the beginning of the downfall. We didn't recognize it. We had hit the iceberg, but just kept on trucking along. So it was catastrophic. Yes.
Let's rewind and let's go to 95. What are the options of walking out?
Of me leaving?
No, what are the other options apart from leaving?
In a way, it's a good question, and I thought about. No, I mean, realistically, I wasn't going to leave the company. I mean, I've got all these stock options. There's a lot of trust that's been put in me. Another alternative, which Ms. Watkins would probably talk about, would be a whistleblower. But I can tell you that having talked with Mark Whitaker at Archer Daniel Midland, if you read any of his story, which one is called a book is called The Informant on him, and the other one is called Rats in the Grain, you'll see the pressures that he was under. And he was a whistleblower. And he, in essence, almost went mad in this undercover sort of role. And his alternative was to tell on the company. And the pressures that were put on him and what happened to him receiving the longer prison sentence than anybody else, even though he was the informant, there was no whistleblower protection then. So I think now you're starting to see a little bit more, I think that would encourage people to tell, to let, say, hey, look, I see something going on and I don't believe that it's correct. That really never came to mind with me, but it was certainly it would have been a better alternative. I'd be speaking to you like Ms. Watkins did rather than in this role. Yes?
Stock options have a lot of value, especially when you work in a company.
Right.
Do you think that stock options should be taken away from CFOs and CEOs? What kind of alternate means instead of stock options should we give these individuals?
Yeah, I won't speak so much to CEOs and CFOs because I really don't know how those compensation packages work other than I'm like you. It seems ridiculous when a guy makes, $100 million in a year. I think that CEOs and CFOs earn their money, and I think we all aspire, to achieve things that would put you in that role. But I can tell you that with employees, particularly somebody like myself, that was so lopsided, so out of whack, that it's dangerous. And if you looked at, there was a number of lawsuits that have come out of the WorldCom experience in particular, where employees, middle managers, are now suing, I won't mention the name, but suing the broker because of bad advice, and they kept their stock options and stuff. But these were middle managers making millions of dollars. They make $50,000, $60,000 a year, and they got $600,000, $1 million worth of stock. Theirs too was a bit out of whack. So I think you should be compensated. Compensation packages among employees need to reflect more what the responsibility is, and you don't need to create this whole everything's driven by stock options. So, yes, sir.
You mentioned that when you see the idea, you prefer to run.
Right.
That you were trying to get advantage of MCI items in connection or something had gone.
Well, I'd say it's more of a disenchantment of what you're doing for a living. I mean, I'm now cheating. The whole purpose of my job now is I cheat. That's what I do for a living. I don't manage accounts receivable anymore because that's too hard. I've got a better solution. I got an eraser. So it wears on you after a while. When you first do it, it's kind of good, but then you quarter after quarter after quarter, it's disturbing. Yes, ma'am, up there.
How did it feel when you turned yourself in, and why do you think it took so long to get there?
It's devastating. I mean, it's surreal. Walking into, and hopefully none of us have to talk to, no offense, U.S. attorneys or FBI agents. It's disturbing. When you're first interviewed and they flash these badges, you're like, oh my God. Why did I wait so long? Fear. There's just no way this is happening to me. My lawyer had told me almost a year before, he said, hey, look, just get used to you're going to go to prison. If you put that in your mind and you don't go, you'll feel all better about it. Well, I didn't feel, that didn't work. I just said, I can't believe it. It's overwhelming. I mean, is the best way that I could describe it. I always assumed that you could get a second chance or something, or maybe I would, go pick up litter on the road or something, at the worst case. But the sentencing guidelines are such that it's all taken out of the judge's hand anymore. They'll give you a sentence based on what you did, how much money it was, and to deviate from that, you're not going to get a break. So you're going to jail. And that's the thing, I never understood that. I didn't know about sentencing guidelines. I do now. I won't give any lectures on that one. It's too disturbing. Yes, ma'am, up there.
Spiral. What do you think is the real genesis of corporate crime? What's really at the root of starting?
Corporate crime was like it. I think in general I don't know. I think it's disenchantment more than money. I mean, I think it's protecting yourself for some of the higher ups that we've seen. I think they get rich on the side because of the risk that they believe that they're taking. But I see it as just hiding that power, just not wanting to be revealed. Kind of like some Wizard of Oz syndrome or something. I mean, even though I didn't need the money, I wasn't like all of a sudden I'd run up a bunch of credit cards myself, and said, oh God, I need a couple of $1 million. It was more, as I described here, it was more of a series of events and things. It wasn't necessarily that I needed the money. So I don't know if it's money driven. I think it's more environment driven. And all of a sudden you get this 10 feet tall and bulletproof sort of thing. Yes?
You mentioned that some director of you just asked you to have, okay, the bad debt this year is going to be this.
Right.
Were there some people raising some of this financial ethics problems? And what happened? Were they threatened by some superior in some way, or physically, or just any job?
No, certainly not physical. I mean, one director under oath at MCI said, well, what happens to employees in collections if they don't meet their goals, or what is the reward if they meet their goals? And his answer was they get to keep their jobs, which is a hell of a motivator. No, I don't recall really any threats. I mean, I think really the way that it started was this is a temporary problem, and it'll go away, and we just need to do it this month or this quarter. And then that turned into another quarter, and that turned into a year, So, I mean, it perpetuated itself after that, because it was indeed a downfall that we didn't see. So, no, it wasn't any sort of threats. Yes, I'm sorry, yes?
I was wondering if you're in the exact same corporate situation as you were back then. Now, I know you obviously wouldn't but just on a material scale, how easy would it be, or how hard would it be to renegotiate this kind of crime? Like, has the legal restrictions been significantly enhanced by the authorities, or is it still a person who's authority?
No, you know what, that brings up like a point that when I talk to the guys at the FBI, I go, I don't even know how to commit a crime. I mean, I don't know how to steal credit cards or, kind of run some other scam. I mean, it all added up in that particular environment. I think you can kind of see that a lot of things came together where it really didn't even look like a crime. I just kind of walked in and, the bank was unlocked. There was nobody there. So, no, I couldn't. I mean, I wouldn't know how. I wouldn't know how to do it. But it brings up a funny thing that happened to me when I went initially to the halfway house. I had to go get a job when I was there, which after a couple of years is, you wonder, all right, who's going to hire me? So I put down all these accounting temp sort of jobs. I'm going to be a temp, and I'll just kind of work for my period in the halfway house. And so she looked at my list. Oh, no. You're not doing any accounting. So I said, all right, well, I mean, look at my hands. I mean, what am I going to do for a living? I don't have really any skills other than the business related. So she said, well, you got to think of something else. So I went back and I filled out my sheet of paper again, and I said, all right, well, I'm going to be in the restaurant business. I'll be a waiter. At least I can make a little bit of money. So I showed her that. And this lady said, no, you can't do that because you have to handle credit cards. And I said, Miss, I sold $6 million, not six. I mean, I'm not exactly going to go out and do this. So, I mean, it just gets to the point that I really don't know, I wouldn't know how to go about committing a crime other than the one that I did. And I walked into it. I definitely walked into it. Yes, sir. Yeah, that part of it just, it was a relief within I wouldn't say that did you say I did not? No, I did. But I mean, after a while, it's not so much the money, but you know what, you wish it was yours. There's a part of you that says, you know what, I really wish I would have earned that, that it's not yours anymore. It's fake. It's like what I was doing in my other job. I traded one thing for another. So did I spend it? No, I spent the hell out of it. Yeah. I mean, it was part of the, that was part of the whole thing. That was part of what I was doing. It was a way that I felt like, all right, it'll make me feel a little bit better. I can tell you it didn't. A lot of people say, oh, if you have money, it's not the most important thing. It really isn't. Easy money goes quickly. I mean, you blow it. You don't even know what you're doing. If you earn your money, you save more. I saved more making $30,000 a year than I ever did with that millions of dollars that we had. It's a fact of life. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that you had taken ethics classes in your MBA program and stuff about it.
Right. Are you asking my grade?
No, but is there anything that you think that we can do to create this pressure for the business world, or is it kind of like just get to that?
This is avoidable. I mean, I work with other people who are under maybe some similar circumstances, maybe not as unique and had the opportunity that I did. I tell you what, I wish that we would take more of what is in the textbooks into the workplace. Because, they always tend to tell you, that's what you had in school. It's not, I don't think that's true. I think you should take more of what you have here, more textbook, more routine, more things like that. I mean, there's a creative part that you need to be. Certainly fraud isn't one of them. But as far as ethics goes, it is common sense. It is common sense. But you know what? Sometimes you got to take a step back and see where you're at and make that right choice. Yes, sir, down here.
Do you feel that you were discriminated against or unfairly by the U.S. Attorney's Office instead of going after the big fry, going after you?
Actually, they're going after the big fries right now. When I was at Edgefield, shortly after the Forbes article came out, I was contacted, or my lawyer was contacted by the SEC to ask me some questions. The agent was planning on coming to visit me while I was in prison. Well, sometime in June, a nuclear bomb went off in Clinton, Mississippi, and I think that's where they're targeting most of their stuff now. And that's a unique situation where they're working, I think, almost from the top down, in that organization. So, no, I don't. And mine was way well before that, but their fraud was going on at the same time as mine, which I find kind of ironic.
Was there any financial fine or reimbursement involved in your sentence?
Yes, I'm currently on a payment plan to repay $5.9 million that I'm doing in very small increments, I might add. Yeah, I do have a restitution that I do have to pay, yes. And 3 years of probation, which I'm on right now. They know where I'm at every day. Yes, ma'am.
What happened to your business partner?
He is currently, which is very funny, he's currently bunkies with Jim Trafficant in Allenwood, Pennsylvania. So there are a couple of characters. Yeah, he received a 54-month sentence, a little bit longer than mine, and he went in much later than I did. He decided to go in later. Yes.
And what do you plan to do from here? Write a book, install a movie about this?
You know what? I have written a book, and I did it like on an IBM typewriter, and it's a work in progress. I did complete something of a book. You know what? I tell you what. If I had to do, I like kind of doing this, and this isn't really what I want to do for a living. But there aren't a lot of CFO jobs currently, where they're clamoring to get me in there. So I'll kind of do this for a while, but I see myself working for myself. I really don't see myself going back into that world. And what I'll do, I don't know. Come down to Savannah, I'll have like a seafood restaurant or something. Could be. Yes, sir.
How long can you practice accounting?
I can practice accounting now. That was just a requirement for the halfway house. So I'm free to. There were no restrictions. As long as I tell them what I did, I can go work anywhere. You want to take one more over here? Okay. I would have liked to say that I would have just quit. I could have gone on and done something else. If you look at the scenario that I drew up, even though I did decide to act selfishly and kind of go in my own direction, I also had my foot in another bucket, and I might be currently under investigation right now in this whole giant WorldCom thing. So not only was there like one bad path to go, for me, there was 2 or 3. The best thing, only in retrospect, was to quit. And I didn't do that, and I wish I would have. Okay.
I wanted to.
Okay.
The approach of the dean normally means the end, but in this case I had a question, so we'll give another round of applause after that. But Mr. Pavlo, there are some law students present as well, and for a substantial period of my life I was a law professor. And there's an ethical side that I wanted to hear some insight on, if you could, about your defense attorney. I did some pro bono defense attorney work. That's to say, it was pro bono in the sense that they couldn't pay for it. My clients went to jail. But I was wondering...
Hate to hear that.
What relationship you had with your defense attorney, and if you feel uncomfortable answering, it's perfectly all right because you've given us so much, but did you tell him the truth right away? Did you play a game with him and try to keep the information from him? And I'm interested in the ethics of a criminal defense attorney, right, who is trying to get you the best possible deal, and I suppose it's, at least at some point, might have been pretending that you were innocent in order, right, to maintain that. Could you speak to that question?
Yeah, sure. When I first met with my attorney, I told him that I said, hey, look, I kind of moved around some accounts receivable, but it's really not that bad. This was after I kind of gotten some wind that some stuff was building, and I had a recommendation from a friend to seek a criminal attorney. That came from my civil attorney. He said, you need to maybe go talk to this guy, because I didn't think he was really buying my story. So I did talk to him, and I lied. I told him that, hey, I don't think I really did anything too wrong. And, I moved some accounts receivable, and man, they're hassling me. Well, he went and talked to MCI and some other people and did a little investigation. He said, hey, Walt, maybe you'd like to tell me about how the accounts receivable and the Cayman Islands, all in kind of one setting here. So I thought, oh, geez, please. How'd you find out? So I did. And then, I asked him that same question now. I said, man, what do I do? How do I talk to you? Do I tell you that I'm guilty? Or I said, I wasn't prepared to do that. And we played a little cat and mouse game for a while. And he did it. His job was more to stop me. He, just, all right, let me take it from there. Perhaps knowing, or maybe some intuition what the next step is going to be, and I took it, So I didn't quite go that far with him, but he did kind of lead me up. And then at some point, it's like, hey, did you do it? And I go, yeah, but how about this other stuff? He says, okay, well, maybe that will work into the negotiations, but if you're guilty, you're most likely going to prison. So it's an evolution. I can tell you that most people, that first instinct has got to be there's nobody in your corner. But one of the things you have to get across to your clients is that this is it, man. I'm on your team. We're going to work through this together. And he did that quickly. After that, I thought it was very good, very helpful.
Professor Alan Dershowitz is quoted in Reversal of Fortune as saying that he never asked his clients what the truth was. He says it'll only get in the way of my defending you. And I sincerely have ethical questions about that.
Sure.
And I appreciate your insight into that. One other observation, if you'll permit. I think that Mr. Pavlo did us a great service today. And in two respects. The story, when it turned into the Cayman Islands, and when your partner suggested a way to fleece those who were fleecing MCI, that's, at least in my reaction, is somewhat unique. But the first half of your story, up until that, where you're given incentives to only write off a little bit and put it forward instead of back and make it look good, that I think is something that sadly a lot of our graduates will be presented with. And so I want to thank you for developing both of those themes and say that the teaching of ethics, at least in my judgment, is best done in this manner, where somebody who's been through it sees redemption in sharing that experience on both of those. On behalf of the Haas School, we want to give you a sweatshirt.
Oh, yeah. Very good.
And we hope that you wear it.
I definitely will.
Recognizing that you did us a service.
Great.
And that we all wish you the very best for the rest of your life.
Very good.
Thank you, Walter.
Thanks a lot, Dean. I appreciate it. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir.